trip. This place is barely mentioned in the Bible. And when I say this place, the city itself here, Skiptopolis, is never mentioned except sort of vicariously. As Ronnie had pointed out, that one of the 10 cities of the Decapolis was Beth Shean. Here's one of the 10 cities. But it's not listed in the Bible. It's only mentioned as the cities of the Decapolis, of which this is included. Hippos, where we were, was one of the Decapolis cities, right up above En-Geb. But all the other cities of the Decapolis are east of the Jordan River. This is the only one that's west. But before they ever moved in, the Greeks ever moved in, what existed was that mound right there. As Ronnie pointed out on the big map, that's the original Beth Shean. That was not Skiptopolis, and it happened to be an ancient Canaanite city that eventually was conquered and occupied by, of all people, the Philistines. The Philistines are a seagoing people. What in the world are they doing this far inland? Well, there's a lot of guesses on that, but this place is the furthest inland city that was conquered and occupied by the Philistines. Otherwise, the Philistines tend to cling to the coast. We'll go down into Philistine country towards the end of next week. It's actually our last day in Israel that we're going to spend time down in that area where David fought Goliath and all of that. But this was a Philistine city. Now, the backstory on this is all I want to talk about here. The lessons are whatever God wants to make of it with you. So just, pray about it and say, God, what are you saying to me through this? Because, frankly, it's very, very appropriate that we tell the story that I'm about to tell you right from the Bible in a theater. Because this story, were it Greek, would be a Greek tragedy. Except for one thing. You see God orchestrating a very tragic situation based on something that was even more tragic that happened before. Boy, this is a real up one, isn't it? Wow, let's have fun. A long time before what we're about to read, Saul, who was king, was a humble man. He was a big man. He was a strong man. He was very impressive. And then he started making really bad decisions in the name of God. Like God winks at certain things he commands us to do. The big one was that he was supposed to destroy an entire city, killing every last man, woman, child, and animal. Now we look at that, and of course the critics of the Bible will say, well, that's horrible. The God you worship is bloodthirsty, and that's ugly, and it's nasty, and oh, how do you explain all of that? Well, actually it's pretty easy to explain if you were God. And that means that, well, is there an explanation? There clearly is. I know some of you know this, but many of you may not know this. That the fact that Saul allowed the family of King Agag to escape execution. Yes, King Agag was executed, but obviously he spared the whole family, and it's real obvious from history that some of them escaped. King Agag was an Amalekite. He was then, they called the people of his family the Agagites. I don't like that name, Agag. It's like, oh man, sick to your stomach all the time or something. But Agag was a really, really bad guy. And Saul said, I spared his family and him and the best of his flocks and herds to give to the Lord. The Lord doesn't want that. We're always looking for loopholes. And Saul had a really bad habit of doing that. And then it all culminated with that one incident that caused God to reject Saul. There was a second one, I'm not going to go into that actually compounded the problem. It seems much less it was important, and that was that he tried to kill the Gibeonites and massacre them, and God already made a covenant with them with his name on it. I'm not going to kill you, and there's some details on that, like I said, we're not going to go into. But with Agag, since he let part of his family live, that hundreds of years later, a descendant of Agag, who happens to be over in the area of Persia, hatches a plot to, on a certain holy day, massacre and annihilate all the Jewish people, and his name was Haman. And with the death of Haman, during the time of Esther, the Agagite and the Amalekite line ended. It was extinct. But the reason God said, Saul, obey me, kill all these people, is because it's going to save all the Jewish people. It's like avoiding a Holocaust. But this is the way it had to be done. Saul didn't think, well, maybe God has a purpose in this. But his bloodiness was to spare lakes of blood, so to speak. I know that's pretty gory. So God rejects Saul. David eventually is anointed king, but he's not king yet. Everybody knows that he's going to be king. But it hasn't happened yet, and Saul kind of goes crazy, and he's got demons hanging out on him and all of that, and he's chasing David down, trying to kill him, when David, who is a pretty rough and tumble guy, and he's got his own faults, but he's done nothing bad against Saul. And finally, Saul is cornered. David, when you'll see over at En Gedi, David cuts the hem off his garment. Actually, Pastor Doug's going to say something about that down there. And that's a very, very significant moment when Saul finally decides, I got to stop chasing David and deal with other business. Now, here's the business. And this begins over in 1 Samuel chapter 27. Now, since I said 27 and 1 Samuel actually ends in chapter 31, you can tell I'm just going to summarize this for you. But I want you to know, read it there. Saul is threatened by the Philistines. The Philistines are coming up from the coast, and they're coming here to Beth Shean. They're also going to another place, which happens to be a little further in that direction, which is the hill of Moreh. They're going to a place called Shunem. Remember, I kept telling you biblical geography is important? Here's the hill of Moreh. This is where Gideon took on the Midianites. On the back side of it is the city of Nain, where Jesus raised the widow's son. And they said, there's a great prophet who's come among us, because right around the corner was another village called Shunem, where the Shunamites' widow was there, and Elijah raised her son from the dead. You know, same thing. And so they're going, wow, this is amazing. That hill. And the Philistines had taken up a position on that hill at Shunem. Now, I know you really can't picture this without a map, but it's just over there. In the meantime, just over here, you have another thing going on where there is a spring. And the spring is Gideon's spring. You're going to go to this next. When we're done here, we get on a bus, and that's where we go, Gideon's spring. Gideon's spring was not just the place where Gideon was. It's where Saul and his army had bivouacked, because there's water there, and it's a good, safe place for the moment. But it's right at the foot of a mountain called Mount Gilboa. And in between them is this valley that we're sitting in right now with Beth Shean right in the middle of it. And it's also a Philistine position, and war is about to happen between Saul and the Philistines. Got the picture? Now, David, it will tell you in here, is on the side of the Philistines. He's been romping around with them, not being entirely loyal to them, by the way, and I think many of you know the story, but he's basically a Philistine ally with his little army. And he's been living in a city called Ziklag, which is way down by the coast, sort of in the direction of Tel Aviv, a little bit further south even than that. So that's pretty far from here. And there he left his family. He left his 2 wives and his children, as well as all of his men, left their wives and their children down there in Ziklag. And he's coming with the Philistine army in this direction. Now, that's right here in the text. Again, I'm summarizing it. Read the whole thing. You say, I don't remember ever reading that. You know why? Because we read the Bible in little tiny bites that somebody helped us take. It's called chapters. God didn't put the chapters in your Bible. They don't belong there. Now, I don't resent that, but it's very inconvenient if you're trying to see the whole story, because the whole end of 1 Samuel is one continuous story. And it begins with the setup that I just explained. Now, it jumps back and forth. I mean, whoever wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel, presumably Samuel wrote the first part of it. By the time he gets here, it's dead. He's dead. But it sounds like a scriptwriter wrote it in Hollywood, because it's very non-linear. And what I mean by that is it tells you about David coming up here with the Philistines towards Beth Shean. Saul is bivouacked over by the by Gideon's spring, and that's Ein Harod, and he's there. David's coming in with the guys that are going to go to war with Saul. Saul gets scared. He disguises himself and he heads over to the backside of the hill of Moreh. He has to literally go around the Philistine positions because it tells us that's where they were. On the hill of Moreh, that was another Philistine position. He's got to fake them out, and he goes around the backside, and there's this town of the village of Endor. And who's at Endor? Endora. No, I don't know what her name was, but the witch at Endor. And he wants to conjure up Samuel because it makes a note right in here that Samuel had died. It reminds us of that. And so he calls upon this witch who is a necromancer. In other words, somebody who raises spirits from the dead. And he says, I need to talk to Samuel. And she says, well, King Saul drove all of the witches and the necromancers out of the country. And if word gets back to him, I'm dead. And they said, well, I'm Saul. You know, she finds out because of what she does next. And she's terrified because she thinks Saul is going to kill her. So the way she finds out he's Saul, she does her thing. And here comes this spirit out of the ground. Now listen to me. We don't know if this was Samuel or a demon. There's debate on this, and I'm not going to debate anybody on it one way or the other. I will tell you this, the only person who saw this spirit was the witch. Saul didn't see her. He had to ask the witch, what does he look like? He didn't see her. She was claiming she saw him, and she was scared because something real happened. I think God, at the very least, intervened in order to send a message through the witch who Saul would listen to, so that he would pay attention to what's going to happen next. And this personage that was either Samuel's soul, or, because God allowed it to happen, not her, or it might have been a demonic thing, who knows, but says, Saul, you're going to be killed tomorrow, you and your sons. Get ready. And that's all the message contains. You're dead. Well, this is horrible. And then, of course, she finds out when this apparition that she sees identifies this disguised man as the king. And Saul does a great deal to say, I'm not going to do anything to harm you, pays her the money. She fixes a feast, which had to take a little bit of time, even there at night, and he feasts, well, it's got to be at least half the night. And then he leaves and goes back to his camp there at Gideon's Spring. The Philistines begin to mount up. In the meantime, you have here, as you're reading through this, you got the witch at Endor in chapter 28, and then it seems like the Bible just changes directions and throws another chapter at you in chapter 29 and chapter 30. And in the short form, what happens is David is confronted by the Philistine leaders through his friend Achish. Achish is a Philistine. And the leaders come to Achish and say, we've been talking about David, and we're about to enter into battle against Saul, and we don't want him here. David's offended by that. He's saying, no, I'm here to serve you guys. I'm here to be with you. Besides, I'm under duress. If Saul sees me, he's going to kill me. And so I'm here to show my loyalty to you. Now, that might have been a feint. But either way, he complains loudly about it. And then something happens. He gets word from a messenger that just rushed up from the coast that Ziklag has been attacked and burned. His family's there. All the guys' families are there. So David packs up and heads for the coast and goes back down by Ziklag, which is in the direction of Beersheba. I mean, it's down there. He goes down that way and he finds the city burned, and they realize from somebody who survived that his wives and kids have been kidnapped, but they're alive. Everything else is destroyed, but they're alive. So he goes after them. The further he goes, the further away from this place he gets. That's called a clue. Who's orchestrating this? It's the hand of God all the way. He's putting David as far away from Saul as he possibly can, because he's preserving David's kingdom to be a kingdom of righteousness and not murder, even though David has been a murderous person. And he will be again. But he has nothing to do with a coup or an insurrection or the assassination of Saul. David is completely out of the picture and really far away in a very short period of time, because when his family gets kidnapped, he goes into high gear to get down there. It probably only took him a very short time to race all that distance. So, the Philistines and Saul and his armies, the Israelites, they finally engage in battle. Over by Ein Harod, the place where you're going next, this is where that battle took place. And as the battle is raging, the Israelites begin to lose, and they get pushed up the sides of Mount Gilboa over here. So they're retreating uphill, fighting. And finally, Saul gets hit by an arrow. All of his sons are killed, including Jonathan, David's very best friend, and his other sons too. And Saul, there's different testimonies about what happened with different details, but he's leaning on his spear. He's mortally wounded. He's got a servant, and he says, "Kill me." And the servant won't do it. So Saul falls on his own sword and dies there on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. And then his servant commits suicide as well, because he wouldn't kill the king. Well, the whole battle was a disaster. Everyone's dead, and the Philistines begin to plunder the bodies. And they come upon the body of Saul and his sons. This is what they did. They cut off their heads, and then they brought the bodies back here to that city, Beth Shean, that had a wall around the top of it. And the wall had all kinds of different things for torture devices and things. That's the way life was back then. I'm sorry, that's the way it was. And they hung the bodies of Saul and Jonathan and Saul's other sons on that wall for all to see, headless bodies. That is gory, that is gross, give you nightmares, but that was the whole idea. We won, and this is what we do to our enemies. Don't even cross us. The Philistines did this. Some men from Jabesh Gilead over in this direction across the Jordan learned about it. They came and saw, and at night they came and stole the bodies, took them back over to Jabesh Gilead and cremated them, which is something they didn't do to people back in those days. The pagans did that, but the Israelites wouldn't do that. They took the bones and they buried them in secret. And that was the end of Saul. And now David is made king. That is one tragedy after another, and it all started because Saul simply tried to find loopholes with God. That's a big one. I've done whole sermons on don't find loopholes. There are none. So if we find a loophole, it's because we created it, not because God gave it to us. And when we make those things, it's simply a rebellion against His will. You say, man, you're meddling again, Jay. You did it yesterday. I know, I'm not going to be this strong all the time, but I needed to tell you because this is a very, very strong, bloody message of what happened here. And that's the story of Beth Shean in the Bible. It's famous really only because this is where the bodies of Saul and Jonathan hung after they were defeated in this terrible disaster. The blessing that came out of it, however, was that God allowed David's family to get kidnapped and the city to get burned to the ground. You say, what a terrible thing. No, it got David out of the picture, and it rolled out the red carpet for him to come in as a king who was a good guy, not a rebel, not an insurrectionist, not an assassin. It put him as far away from the battle as God could get him in a day. Isn't that amazing? So that's the story of Beth Shean.